So when I heard that Marilyn was going to talk about her garden, I went looking for images of gardens and growth and all those sacred books that we keep on shelves in ministers' offices, and it was too much to choose one from another. We forget that those ancient peoples didn't have electricity or automobiles. What they had were sun and rain and fields, and they lived their lives closer to the growing things than do we. So can we be surprised that even books of sacred qualities like the Bible should be filled with nature imagery? Few words that I found that seem to be appropriate for the day, for the hour of worship, because sometimes it is better for us to learn from them that grow. In the psalm, it says, "You have prepared the land, drenching its furrows, breaking up its clods, softening it with showers, blessing its yields. You have crowned the year with your bounty and with abundant harvest. The fallow meadows overflow, the valleys are blanketed with flocks. They shout and sing for joy." And in Isaiah, in passages read at this time of year in synagogues as the new year approaches, a time of reckoning and of waiting. The wilderness and dry land shall be glad. The desert shall rejoice and blossom. Like the crocus, it shall blossom abundantly and rejoice with joy and singing. What a wonderful image that plants and flowers sing and shout. I think we should give them some help by singing to them and for them. So we're going to lift our voice in song. Does it strike you as odd as it does me that church is probably the only place in your entire week, much less sometimes your entire life, when you sing in public and allow others to hear? And yet is what we do, and we wouldn't be worship if we didn't do it. And so I would bid you to sing this hymn number 74, which is about our earth and its abundance in its way, and to sing aloud, because if the crocuses can't hear you, they will not blossom. Shall we gather our voices in song and raise the earth to its glory by singing hymn number 74, On the Dusty Earth Drum. As a former trombonist, I always give way to better trombones. You can tell he's a good trombonist. He takes the mouthpiece with him. Good boy, yes. See, Charlie's doesn't play as much, so he left his mouthpiece there. So learn from the pros, Charlie. What can I say? Welcome. My task is, among other things, to bid you welcome. A welcome to Fountain Street Church, a center of liberal religion in Grand Rapids for 150 years. That gives us pride and pause. Pride that we have maintained an open-hearted, open-minded, and open-armed approach to spiritual life through generations that found that troubling, if not downright dangerous. We are glad to say that after 150 years, other houses of worship have awakened to the promise of an open-hearted, open-minded, and open-armed faith. We are not the only place in town where you can think for yourself, where you can find your own way, where you can plot chart a course through life that suits you. On the other hand, we are proud that we maintain that, and we invite you to take part in that as well. If you're new to us, please talk to me afterward. My name is Fred Wooden. I'm one of the clergy who serve here. Be glad to tell you more about this church and how it might be a part of your life in any number of ways. I'm also here to extend a welcome to someone who needs no introduction to most of us and actually is worthy of our best introductions, Marilyn Ossentjuk, our music director, who for now 14 or 15 years has served, 16 years has served, well, you preceded me, and so anything that's older than me has clearly been here since God was a pup. But my point is that you are, in some ways, we are our second most senior staffer in years served. And you have served under many administrations. You have endured the most recent one, meaning me. And we have enjoyed your wisdom and your creativity over a number of years. And you step into a new role today by opening your mouth to words rather than employing your fingers in music, and I'm sure eloquence will be no less true today than any other Sunday. Many other things go on in this church. You can find word of them in this bulletin, and you may certainly find more on our website if you wish to go there. Next Sunday, Labor Day Sunday, when all of you will be preferably at near some lake, but I will not. I will be here by myself, speaking on why I am religious but not spiritual. Otherwise, it is a love to see you all here today. It is an honor always to have you in our presence, you who are familiar and you who are new. And I bid you now to join with me as we give some intentionality to the hour by sharing these words from the Ute Indians of North America, found in our hymn book but printed here for your convenience. Earth, teach me stillness as the grasses are stilled with light.
Earth, teach me suffering as old stones suffer with memory.
Earth, teach me caring as parents who secure their young.
Earth, teach me courage as the tree which stands all alone.
Earth, teach me limitation as the ant which crawls upon the ground.
Earth, teach me freedom as the eagle which soars in the sky.
Earth, teach me resignation as the leaves which die in the fall.
Earth, teach me regeneration as the seed which rises in the spring.
Earth, teach me to forget myself as melted snow forgets its life.
Earth, teach me to remember kindness as dry fields weep with rain.
That's a keeper, I think. I would like to make mention and offer gratitude to our pianist, hidden from your view, but no less visible to our ears, Cameo Elzinga, who is part of a family in our character school, but also a very accomplished musician. And I am so glad you're here with us this morning. Perhaps the first notable American-born and reared composer in the European tradition. And he created a colony for artists in New England called the MacDowell Colony, where a number of later American composers, authors, poets gathered in the summer to create some of the great works that we now enjoy in our own lives. So not only was he a great composer, he was a great gardener of composers. Since we're talking about gardens today, I'm absolutely mindful of that old, almost Victorian phrase, "You're nearer God's heart in a garden than any place else on earth." I don't know if that's true. I spent about an hour and a half in my, quote, garden last night, really my backyard, a small backyard, digging out the ferns that would take over in a heartbeat if I didn't beat them back. Not that they don't deserve to live, but we negotiate our presence on the planet. They get to grow 24 hours a day. I get to kill them only for an hour a week. And in the process of pulling up these ferns and other things that grow so cheerfully in my absence, I was reminded of all the living that goes on out of sight. I pull up a stump from an old dead tree or from one of those ferns, and a long, slithery, creepy-looking worm suddenly appears, looking quite frightened and much disturbed, and slithers as quickly as it can back into the dirt. I pile a little dirt back onto it. Little crawling things that never come into the house, thank goodness, are running all over the place. And then there are the things I cannot see even when I'm up close, perhaps the microbes that attach. There are the little bulbs that look like they could be, well, crocuses, but they're not. They're wild onions that seem to love growing in my yard in the spring. And I'm reminded that every time I step into the world, I am stepping into someone else's world. That the sidewalk may stand upon the earth, but it's a very thin veneer over the teeming life beneath it and around me. And I sometimes wonder if gardening and lawn care and the pulling of ferns isn't about how much we control it, but a reminder of how little control we actually have over anything. And with that sense of humility, I invite you into a time of prayer and meditation. Yea, earth, however made, however fashioned, by whom or neither, you do teach us. There is a stillness even as you race through the sky. We do not feel the passing leagues of space that yield as we whip around the sun, only occasionally reminded by the shadow of the moon that we are in fact racing through space and time. Yes, earth, in your quiet, you remind us to be quiet, that we need not speak to be present. And yes, earth, you remind us that we can love without hearts and flowers or poetry, even if we only step gently to avoid the worm or pluck the spider about to be squashed. Yes, earth, you teach us every day if we incline our ear and open our eye, if we step with mind upon the dirt, upon the stones. You teach when we look along the horizon and sense the waters clinging and yet also leaping. You teach when the sun vanishes behind the curve that we cannot see but can sense, and colors that we cannot make wave goodbye to the light and then return again when dawn sends its earliest fingers over the horizon. We need to learn so much more. We have only begun to learn. And here in the midst of this structure built by human hands, we are cut away and off from the teaching the earth allows. Perhaps when we leave, we will give an eye to the smaller things that lie about us. Flower or weed, charming woodland creature or centipede, and find that all of it belongs, all of it matters, even us. For such learning, we pray, and in quiet we wait for wisdom. And so may it be, and amen. I found that silence hard to end today. I was really resting in it for a moment. But you are here not only to listen, but to hear and to do. Marilyn came to me this morning, and I to her and said, "So, Marilyn, what parts would you like me to do?" And she said, "Everything but the sermon." And then she said, "Unless you'd like to do the sermon too," and handed me the book. And I said, "No." Ironically, I can speak in public with nary a thought, but the idea of performing in public freezes me solid. Whereas you would much rather play an organ in front of 1,000 people than utter words in front of 100. We are a good pair that way. And really, I have to say that working with Marilyn has been one of the greatest pleasures of serving this community. It's been, to say a friendship would be inappropriate, and yet there's a comradeship that is very real. And to have watched her, to have watched Jim and Joe become the family they've become, and they've watched my family become. And we don't socialize, but I think there's a remarkable investment we have in each other so that her well-being is truly connected to mine. Thank you. 2 readings she chose. The first one of which is extracted in our hymn book, but this is a longer version of it. It's from the wonderful poet Marge Piercy. It's titled "The Seven of Pentacles." For those who don't know, the tarot card deck contains a number of suits that are unlike the ones we have now, pentacles being one of them, meaning the 5-pointed star. And each of them, in their moment, as they're laid down in a certain sequence, yields a certain information or insight. One would say it's a fortune telling, but it's more a reading of the spirit. And so she refers to this card, the 7 of Pentacles, which I don't understand, but that's the connection. If you're a tarot card person, please inform me later. The poem stands on its own. Under a sky the color of pea soup, she is looking at her work growing away there actively, thickly like grapevines or pole beans as things grow in the real world, slowly enough. If you tend them properly, if you mulch, if you water, if you provide birds that eat insects a home and winter food, if the sun shines and you pick off caterpillars, if the praying mantis comes and the ladybugs and the bees, then the plants flourish, but at their own internal clock. Connections are made slowly. Sometimes they grow underground. You cannot tell always by looking at what is happening. More than half the tree is spread out in the soil under your feet. Penetrate quietly as the earthworm that blows no trumpet. Fight persistently as the creeper that brings down the tree. Spread like the squash plant that overruns the garden. Gnaw in the dark and use the sun to make sugar. Weave real connections. Create real nodes. Build real houses. Live a life you can endure. Make love that is loving. Keep tangling and interweaving and taking more in, a thicket and bramble wilderness to the outside, but to us interconnected with rabbit runs and burrows and lairs. Live as if you liked yourself, and it may happen. Reach out. Keep reaching out. Keep bringing in. This is how we are going to live for a long time. Not always, for every gardener knows that after the digging, after the planting, after the long season of tending and growth, the harvest comes. And now a much shorter poem by the great Polish poet Czesław Miłosz. A day so happy, fog lifted early, I worked in the garden, hummingbirds stopping over the honeysuckle flowers. There was no thing on earth I wanted to possess. I knew no one worth my envying him. Whatever evil I had suffered, I forgot. And those are the readings.
I've discovered this week it takes a village to put together a chapel talk. And I want to thank my village that is doing this with me this morning. The talk is only a small part of the service, and even if my talk is awful, I think it was worth your while today because there's so many other beautiful things that have already occurred today. Thank you to Charlie, Matthew, and Bob for the Poulenc Sonata. Charlie suggested this last May. He knew of this wonderful piece, and they have spent, I know, hours practicing individually to learn the piece and together. So thank you so much for adding that this morning. And Cameo, thank you, as always, for your always beautiful, sensitive playing. Fred, thank you for doing things with words that I admire but cannot do myself. It's a joy and an honor to have you here this morning. And thank you, Heather Palmer, who has the eyes and the soul of an artist. I've gradually learned this about Heather. She came over to my house 2 times over the weekend. We walked around the garden. I asked her to help me make a bouquet for this morning, and this is the result. So I never could have done that by myself. And thank you all for being here. It's such a joy for me to be, a joy and a real blessing in many, many ways for me to be part of the spiritual community here at Fountain Street Church. And I will forever be grateful that I've had this opportunity to work with you and get to know you. So let's talk about the garden, and let's see if I am clicking correctly. Yes, I am. Okay. So I have newfound empathy for Mrs. Bucket or Mrs. Bouquet, from the PBS show Keeping Up Appearances. You know who I'm talking about? She always wants everything to be so perfect, and there's always some fatal flaw, right? Well, this is probably the only time in my life that I'll ever stand in front of, I don't know, a couple hundred people and talk about my garden. And all summer, I've really wanted it to look especially good because I knew this was coming. And it was looking pretty good, right? That's not bad. And then on Friday, the city of Grand Rapids came and planted a porta potty in my yard because there's going to be a huge amount of road work done on the road right outside our house, and they're going to need facilities. So now my pretty good-looking garden also includes this porta potty, which anybody in Grand Rapids can drive by and see. So I share Mrs. Bucket's frustration. I know that my vocational calling is to work as an organist and a church musician and a teacher. But I've always also heard a secondary, quieter calling to be outside. And a lot of you probably don't know this about me at all. To be outside, to work with a garden. As a child, I remember playing hide and seek in my grandfather's very large perennial garden, and that was fun. And I always enjoyed helping my mother water the plants and do things in the childhood garden at our house. But my real waking up to gardening, and by the way, my first lesson that I've learned from the garden, and I have for you today, is wake up. So my own waking up to this desire to garden didn't really occur until I was in my early 30s. And my husband and I had bought our starter home right here near downtown Grand Rapids. It was a wonderful historic home, and it came with an old foundation planting of really overgrown evergreens And behind those evergreens is a nice porch, but as you see, we couldn't see anything from our porch with the evergreens. They didn't look that great. They kind of had to go, right? And so they went, and for the first time in my life, all of a sudden, I had a 6-foot by 15-foot plot of empty land, and I was in charge of figuring out what to do with it. And I think that first summer, my solution was a 6 by 15 foot of bright yellow snapdragons. As the snapdragons grew, my interest and pleasure in this new hobby of creating beauty with plants as a medium also grew. And from those snapdragons, I gradually progressed to gardening schemes with trees and shrubs and perennials. And over the next several years, as my husband will certainly agree, there was less and less lawn and more space devoted to garden on that very small city lot. And I started reading everything I could find about gardening, plants, and landscape design. I went on garden tours. I studied what other people did, and I took notes about what I liked and thought maybe would work. I would go look at a 20-acre garden and then write down, well, I think this would work on our 1/10 acre. I'm pretty sure it would. I'm sure that grove of trees would work. I signed up for our local master gardening course. I read online garden forums. There was one gal whose username was Gotta Garden, and I thought that should have been mine because I really had to garden, just like I have to be a musician, and I also had to adopt it and raise a child, and that's a whole other story. But so here's our first lesson. Whatever your passion is, whether it's a sport or writing or travel or singing or tasting wine or tutoring or whatever it is, the first lesson from my ordinary garden is to wake up and listen to what is calling you. Listen to what makes your heart sing, and then go for it with everything that you have. Second lesson is don't hit the mic with your page. And after that, second lesson is to let go. So the snapdragons were annuals, and they only live one season, right? And then they totally die off in a harsh Michigan winter. But I also started planting perennials, and they die to the ground when the temperatures get cold, but hopefully re-emerge the following spring. Well, that first spring, I kind of doubted that my perennials would really come back because I had tried some other hobbies, like home sewing, and it hadn't been a real triumph for me. I would wear something I made and people would say, "Oh, did you make that?" And I just knew that wasn't good, right? So I was kind of pessimistic that my perennials would come back. So you can imagine with me my thrill when one really nasty March day, it was cloudy and there was ice in the backyard, and you know exactly what I'm talking about, right? I was walking around the soggy backyard, and I noticed that some of the plants from the previous summer were sending up tiny little green alive shoots. And I hadn't done anything, right? I just spent my winter inside thinking about it. I hadn't done anything to help this happen. And praise be, they came back. And the zillions of perennials and other things I planted since mostly have come back. And it's got nothing to do with me. It just happened. And that is our second lesson. Sometimes it's best to let go and trust the process, and it's all going to happen the way that it's supposed to. Third lesson is about connection. That's my garden. No. No, that's not my garden. My garden is ordinary. I wish that were my garden. I wish it were one of those incredible English gardens that surrounds a castle and has 10 full-time paid gardeners to keep it looking perfect. Or the gardens at Meyer Garden. That would be nice, right? In my backyard, with hundreds of volunteers along with the full-time paid gardeners. And I'd love to look at pictures of gardens like this and to visit them. And on good days, they're more inspiring than discouraging to me, right? On bad days, I want to go home and rip out my garden because it just doesn't measure up at all. So now we're living on a little more than half an acre, which is nice for a gardener. We have very heavy clay soil, and a good third of the lot that we're on right now it's never ever been developed. It's just kind of an overwhelming pit of weeds and millions of thistles and junky shrubs and pieces of scrap metal and old tires and cinder blocks. And we call it the jungle. And if money were, that's about a third of our 6/10 of an acre lot, right? If money were no object, my husband and I years ago, we would have written someone a big check, and they would have come and made all that ugly go away, and it would be really pretty, and it would have, a patio and a pond and a waterfall, and kind of look maybe like that, right? But money is an object. And my husband and I work full time, and we have a child, and we have extended family, and we have friends, and we have other interests. And also, I won't use herbicides, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. So I have to tackle the jungle with a trowel and a shovel. And so I'm gaining on the jungle at about the rate of about 1 square foot a year, okay? So that's my reality. But I'm talking about connection. So as they live on their properties, gardeners develop relationships with the plants in our care. On another part of our property, not in the jungle, we have a gorgeous mature dogwood tree, which happily someone planted right outside a kitchen window where we get to see it many times every day. Oh, didn't learn that lesson yet, did I? And so I've lived in pretty close proximity to that dogwood now for 11 years, and I know it pretty well. And I know that in the summer, its beautiful horizontal branches are going to provide cradles for birds to nest, and they do. And it's going to provide refreshing shade for us people, and it does. And right now, its berries are ripening. And I know that in a few weeks, it's going to be visited by flocks of robins and cedar waxwings, and they're going to make all those berries go away in just a couple of days. And then its leaves are going to turn a beautiful deep burgundy, and when the sun shines through, they'll look like stained glass. And all winter long, it's going to be visited by many, many birds who like to rest there between their trips to our bird feeders. And then in March, its buds will start swelling already as it prepares for its May display of just stunning white flowers, which are just a gift. They're so beautiful. And there aren't too many plants in Michigan that offer the kind of year-round interest that my dogwood tree offers. And I really appreciate that tree, and I feel connected to it. Silly as that may sound, I have a relationship with that tree. If something bad were to happen to that tree, it would hurt me. And I have a relationship with a lot of the plants in my yard. When we moved onto this property, my primary goal for the whole property was to make it kind of a suburban sanctuary for insects and birds and other wildlife. And I've been really intentional about choosing plants that will provide food and shelter for them. I am inexplicably happy when I walk around my property and I notice bees buzzing over the flowers, or I sit there for a while and start noticing all the birds that are there. And when I walk around our neighborhood in the evening, there's one neighbor, I notice a real line of demarcation between their property and ours. They do a lot of pesticides on their property. And I walk by there and there's no crickets, there's no birds. I get up to our property and I hear the hum of what I call my summer orchestra, the crickets and the cicadas. So I know that, the decisions that we've made for what to do with our property is influencing the way that wildlife is using it. And that's deeply satisfying to me. So my garden is ordinary, but it's also teeming with all kinds of nature and life, and I live in relationship to that nature and life. And just as my life is richer for being part of this community, it's also richer for being part of that community that shares my property with me. My fourth lesson is about hard work and keeping the faith. And this is meant to be encouraging to new gardeners. When I started gardening, the plants grew and so did the weeds. And I thought that if I weeded one time in the spring, then that was it, right? Check. That was funny, wasn't it? And if the weeds kept coming back, I must be doing something wrong because I had weeded, right? Fortunately, somewhere along the way, I figured out that really, if you're alive and you have a garden, you're going to have weeds. It just goes with the territory, especially if you don't use herbicides. And then the other thing I have learned over the years is that to keep the garden free of weeds and looking its best takes an unbelievable amount of time and hard work. And if you let up for 1 week, the weeds will come back, right, Fred? Or the ferns will, right? And so sometimes I do all that hard work and it's like cleaning the house, it instantly looks better. Sometimes I do all that hard work and really it almost might look worse. It takes a long time sometimes to see the results of that investment of care and work. But like I was telling you about the wildlife that's now on the property that wasn't there when we first moved in, it does happen. So this is my lesson of encouragement to new gardeners, is work hard, keep the faith, and the harvest will come, although not for a long time after you sow your seeds. My fifth lesson is about death. If you observe a garden for more than one summer, you will observe death in the garden. The vegetables and the annuals in Michigan die when the temperatures become too cold in the fall. And in my garden, plants have died because of reasons which involve me, I'm afraid. I've even developed a saying, if you aren't killing plants, you aren't really gardening. I've tried to force plants to grow in the wrong soil or light conditions, and they've died. And I've forgotten to water them, and they've died. And bunnies eat them. Isn't he cute? And he eats them and they die. And deer eat them until they're dead. Yes. And then there's the annual leaf fall from our deciduous trees, right? Those leaves are dead. And I grew up, as I'm sure many of you did, raking those leaves into plastic bags to be carted away by the city, right? And since then, I've learned that the leaves might look like they've lost all their relevance, but the fact is that only when they finally start to decompose will they really add nutrients to the soil and feed those tiny creatures whose lives are actually dependent upon things decaying. I read that in 1 square yard of soil, there can be more than 1 trillion microbes. 1 trillion microbes in 1 square yard of soil, and they're working hard. They're breaking down the decaying leaves, the other decaying plants, and alongside them are, ingesting them are worms and snails and some of those creepy crawlies Fred was talking about, crickets, other insects. Those in turn will become snacks for the birds, the toads, and other small mammals. So the ordinary garden and the bunny teach us the extraordinary lesson that without death there cannot be life. My last lesson is about resistance. You say, resistance? What does that have to do with working in the garden? Well, I'm going to let you in on the secret that I think gardeners can be some of the most stubbornly resistant people that there are. Now you know. First of all, we spend inordinate amounts of time and money creating beauty for its own sake. There's no profit, right? We spend money to do it. If we're growing our own produce, we're resistant to the cultural assumption that produce comes from the store and has to have harmful additives to help it, look more pretty and last longer. It has to have energy, costly transportation to bring it from where it grows to our doors. We're resisting all that. On my 6/10 acre lot, as I said before, I adamantly resist declaring war on life. And that means that I will avoid using herbicides and pesticides if there's any other choice. Occasionally, there hasn't been another good choice, and I've very reluctantly used them. I resist using chemical fertilizers, which can run into the groundwater and poison it. And finally, within the parameters of our property, I will resist any action that leads to further destruction of our planet. I told you we're resistant. Most of you know that the honeybees are facing a struggle for their very survival these days. And if they don't survive, I'm not sure that people will survive. And I care a lot about that. My ordinary garden has taught me, an ordinary introverted gardener who dislikes conflict, that sometimes it's imperative to resist. When I started writing this talk, I was concerned I wouldn't have enough material. And now I'm regretful that I have to leave so many things out. You've heard just a few of the dozens of lessons that I've learned from my ordinary garden. I'm going to turn this page without doing that. The bottom line for me is that I have the call. I woke up, I have this call, right? Like we talked about in the beginning. I need beauty and harmony in my life, whether they come from relationships or music or a garden. I have to honor that part of my younger self that was compelled to create beauty where those overgrown evergreens had been. I need space in my life to notice the cycles of the trees, the flowers, the insects. I need to plant and harvest produce, and I need to create gardens which give me and my neighbors joy, while at the same time supporting the birds, the butterflies, and other insects and creatures which share my property with us. I will continue to observe my garden. I will continue to learn lessons that it has yet to teach me, and to do what I can for our earth and for all of us, because I have no other choice. Thank you.
Just let that sink in for a few seconds. The lesson you taught that may not realize you were teaching was that we are all capable of wisdom if we allow ourselves to learn from things we overlook. The things that do not speak in words but in colors and scents, that make their wisdom known not in sentences but in petals. Also, that I was told years ago that a weed is any plant growing where you do not want it to. It is not a species, it's an interloper.
A good plant in the wrong place is a weed.
Yes. But I also discovered that sometimes what I think as a weed, if I wait long enough, will turn into a volunteer that will make beauty that I did not expect. Anyone here have purslane growing in your yard? And I was always pulling it up and it's always coming back. And at some point I decided my little vegetable patch was going to have ground cover, and it was going to be purslane since it insisted on being there. And as long as I take a little bit away to make room for the parsley or the chives or the strawberry plant, it generally gets along very well. Likewise, the lettuce that I planted for several years, at least half of it seemed to go to the rabbits. And I said, how can I stop the rabbits? And then I said, wait a minute. I'm the interloper here, not them. Strictly speaking, it's their world that I'm living in, not mine that they're living in. And so I decided that if I ended up with half a crop and they ended up with half, that was a goodly rent to pay for sharing the land with them. Humility is a lesson that you implied at every turn. Our final hymn this morning, I'm going to point out, it's a beautiful one. We don't sing it with this text often. We usually sing it with Hail the Glorious Golden City. And what an interesting poise, because this is a text, earth was given us as a garden. City versus country. The human fabric and the earth-born fabric. So, with the same zeal and joy we give the golden city, let us remind ourselves that the earth was given. That is a gift that we received without merit and asking. And that we are in the position to live with it, not in charge of it. So, we will lift our voices and sing like the garden we are as we conclude our hour of worship with our hymn number 207, Earth Was Given as a Garden. Thank you.